I don't care that Piers Morgan uttered the word genocide. I don't care that The Guardian published an editorial recognizing the horrific situation in Gaza. I care about the millions of people who have hit the streets consistently in solidarity with Palestine. And I think it's there where we'll see real possibility for change. From Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, I am Yara Hawari, and this is Rethinking Palestine. For more than 2 months, the Israeli regime has been preventing any form of aid from entering Gaza. It's important to clarify that the aid that was entering prior to this was a drop in the ocean and was far from meeting the basic needs of a population facing genocide. But the situation has significantly worsened over the last few months, and hundreds of thousands of people are now literally starving. In addition to this forced starvation campaign, the Israeli army has decided to expand its military ground offensive and bombardments under the ominous title of Operation Gideon's Chariots. Netanyahu wants to gain what he calls operational control over the entire Gaza Strip. So dire is the situation now that even some of Israel's staunchest allies, including the UK and Canada, have rebuked Netanyahu. This has also coincided with a shift in some mainstream media spaces, and a common phrase that has been thrown around recently is that the tide is turning on the genocide in Gaza. But is this really the case? Joining me to discuss this is Al-Shabaka's policy fellow, Tariq Kenney-Shawa. Tariq, thank you for joining me on this episode of Rethinking Palestine.
Thank you for having me on, Yara, as always.
So this phrase of the tide turning has been used a lot, especially in the last 2 weeks. What are people talking about exactly?
Yeah, so I want to talk about whether the tide is actually turning. I'm not sure that's a fully accurate statement. I think, of course, what we've been noticing over the past couple of weeks and maybe over the past 2 months has been more voices from the mainstream media space that are maybe not saying genocide explicitly, but more outright condemning, the indefensible, which is Israel's starvation policy on Gaza. And it seems to me, my reading of this is that there has been more of a visceral reaction to the reports and images of starving children coming out of Gaza than there have been to the 18 months of aerial bombardment and killing through and bombardment bombs and bullets and all that. And I think maybe there might be a conversation to be had about whether there's a difference in people perceive a difference in how people are being killed in that sense, whether it's through starvation or bombs. And maybe some people believe that the starvation tactic is more indefensible than blowing up a school because they buy into Israel's narrative that they're targeting Hamas. But I think that it all kind of ties down to, I guess, what I would call the Trump effect. And, since coming into office, Israel has been acting with even more of a blank check under Trump's administration than they were under Biden. And like you said, I mean, before the ceasefire collapsed, Israel was only permitting a performative trickle of aid into Gaza. But I think that aid was very performative, right? What the Biden administration did, and did so well, was creating a situation in which Israel could get away with the genocide in the long run. And they did so by providing this facade of sorts, right? Using this humanitarian rhetoric, talking about the importance of getting aid in. And I think to many in the international community and in the mainstream media, they saw this as basically as facilitating a situation in which, this was a gruesome war, but at least, the powers that be are trying to get some aid in, period. And what's happened since the ceasefire is not very strictly, like Israel has not allowed any aid in, and the Trump administration hasn't engaged in that performative aid provision mission, right? And I think that is the difference, right? That's the difference we're seeing, is that, while the fundamentals of this genocide remain the same, right? The killing from the air, the killing from the ground, and the mass starvation campaign, it's become a lot more transparent as to what's happening, and the Trump administration has kind of done away with any of that performative steps that the Biden administration took to insulate Israel from international criticism by pretending there was an aid mechanism going on. And I think that is really what has changed over the last 2 months or so.
Tariq, you mentioned voices in the mainstream media, and we've seen editorials from the likes of The Guardian and the Financial Times, really damning pieces on the West's inaction and Israeli aggression. Pieces that I think would have been more welcome 19 months ago and feel far too late now. But also, and to be quite frank, entirely hypocritical, because there's absolutely in these editorials, there's absolutely no reflection on the role that the mainstream media has played in manufacturing consent for the genocide to take place in the first place, and for this situation of mass and forced starvation. Lest we forget that these media outlets were parroting Israeli propaganda lines for months on end, whilst also systematically dehumanizing Palestinians. You know, we didn't reach this point out of nowhere. There were steps, systematic steps that were taken to get to a point where Palestinians are so dehumanized that only now people are beginning to be horrified. You know, even Piers Morgan has had this epiphany. But what's noticeable about this shift, and you mentioned this, it's not that all along this has been genocidal. It's that only now is it becoming genocidal, as if the bombing, the killing, the wanton destruction, everything else up until this point was fine. But now this is where the red line has been crossed. And I'm wondering if you think this is also, I mean, you mentioned about sort of the lack of that performative action, but is this also because people are conscious of a reckoning with complicity in the genocide?
It really depends. When we're talking about the mainstream media, I think it really varies platform to platform. So, for example, like you said, The Guardian and the Financial Times are both two great examples of relatively mainstream publications who have come out with very, very strongly worded condemnations of the widespread complicity in the genocide in Gaza. But then on the other side of the spectrum, we have the New York Times, we have BBC News, which very much seen as these liberal bastions of objectivity and really maintain that reputation. And they have really yet to reverse their complicity and their role in manufacturing consent for this genocide. So, for example, like the BBC continues to describe basically any medical source in Gaza as Hamas run or Hamas affiliated, which automatically, right off the bat, for many people, is seen as a means of discounting any reports from Gaza, period. So I think that, first of all, like there is this, I think when we're talking about the tides shifting, I really don't want to jump the gun. I want to be realistic about who is shifting these tides, and so I think there's a long way to go before the tides actually shift when it comes to other mainstream platforms like the New York Times and BBC. But I do think that these other platforms like the Financial Times or the Guardian are recognizing what is absolutely a shift in public opinion, and that means growing opposition to Israel's genocide in Gaza. That is especially pronounced in the West, in the U.S. For months now, the U.S. public has been exposed to images of the atrocities being committed in Gaza, and that's largely thanks to social media, which makes the proliferation of those images possible, and that wouldn't happen without social media. And of course, there's a lot of censoring, and there's many ways that news and reports from Gaza are being censored and silenced, but still a lot of those images get out. And I think platforms like Financial Times, platforms like The Guardian, platforms like the Washington Post are responding to that shift in public opinion by kind of like recognizing the fact that more and more people are kind of like recognizing the indefensible nature of this genocide. And it's getting it I'm not sure about, the legal aspects of it, because, these outlets manufactured consent for the Iraq War and have never, faced any consequences for that. But I do believe in the saying that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, everyone is going to say that they were against this, right? And I think this part of this is a reckoning in that sense. It's a recognition by these platforms that as more and more people turn against this and see this as completely indefensible, they're going to want to be on the right side of history. And some platforms are just further along in this process than others. And I have no doubt that even the New York Timeses and the BBCs are going to reach this point. But I think, by the time that they do, it's going to be far too late.
And we know from history, after World War II, for example, suddenly everyone had been part of the resistance against the Nazis. When Mandela was freed, suddenly everyone had been part of the anti-apartheid movement. So there is precedence for this kind of behavior. I want to switch gears a bit and think about sort of the diplomatic level, because we have also seen some slightly stronger rhetoric from some of Israel's staunchest allies, as I mentioned earlier, in a joint statement released on Monday, the 19th of May. The British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Emmanuel Macron, and the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said that their respective countries would take, quote, concrete actions, end quote, if the Israeli regime continued its expansion of military operations in Gaza. And then they also, of course, called for humanitarian aid to be immediately allowed in. And this was a sort of stop this latest military assault or else kind of statement. But I think the or else is not particularly compelling, especially given the concrete actions that the UK, for example, has taken so far, which has been the suspension of negotiations over a future trade deal, the summoning of the Israeli ambassador to the UK, and sanctioning a few settlers in the West Bank. So, these are really very performative actions, which amount nothing more than a slap on the wrist. And of course, I don't need to remind everyone that there was a red line and sort of ultimatum that was given before during this genocide back in 2024. Rafah was considered a red line. We all remember when the hands off Rafah sort of social media post went viral, and we saw a lot of other countries branding around their sort of what else's. But Israel then did proceed to invade Rafah, and we saw what happened. It was completely decimated. And the thing is, the UK could be really strong on this. It does have leverage because the UK is still selling arms to Israel, arms that are used to kill Palestinians. They are still flying RAF planes from their bases in Cyprus to fly over Gaza on reconnaissance missions, where they share that information collected with the Israelis. So they could, if they wanted to, set in motion concrete actions that could lead to, for example, an arms embargo. But the reality is, under Keir Starmer's government, they won't do that. So I'm just wondering if you think there is a possibility that some countries will take more concrete actions, unlike the UK, which is, obviously performing outrage.
I'm glad you kind of brought up the Rafah red line example, because I think what I'm seeing now is where that tide shifting stops, right? The tide might be shifting when it comes to public opinion. The tide might be shifting when it comes to even a substantial section of the mainstream media. And I think that, the governments of Britain, Canada, France, they're reacting to that, right? But I very much see them as reacting because they want to return the paradigm to the Biden status quo, right? Which was the continuation of genocide, but under this, facade of international law and processes and human rights and minimal aid provision. So basically, what I see in Britain's actions and Canada's actions and France's actions, while it is, they're absolutely taking steps, quote unquote, whether those steps will actually will actually affect the situation is an entirely different question. And if you listened, for example, to Lamy's address to Parliament, he was making a very heartfelt and desperate appeal to the Israeli people, right? If you listen to him. And he was saying, just give us something to work with. And I think Bezalel Smotrich kind of responded to him directly when he said very publicly about, why they decided to let in those, I think it was 90 aid trucks that they eventually let in total over the week. And I think the first day it was 9 aid trucks that they let in. And Smotrich was saying, we're only doing this so that our international allies can get off our back and let us finish the job in Gaza. That's the only reason why we're doing this. And he very explicitly said, he was saying, like, these 9 aid trucks, they're not even a drop in the water. They're not even like, they won't fundamentally change the situation at all. Palestinians are still starving. This is just, this is just to, again, to get our international allies that we need the weapons from, we need the financial support, we need the diplomatic shielding from, to get off our backs. And so while it kind of, goes back to what we were discussing earlier about it's the Trump effect, the traditional liberal world is saying, and what I mean by the traditional liberal world is Britain, Canada, France, and their approach now. What they're saying is that this Trump approved process of not even engaging in the performative aid provisions, that's not okay. But the Biden paradigm, that's fine. We can return to the Biden paradigm of full on genocide with a performative trickle of aid. That is something that we support. Israel, work with us. Let us get back to that paradigm, and you can continue to finish the job. That's basically it. And I think that when it comes to other countries and across the global South, I think we will continue to see countries stepping up. I think trying to do more. Countries like South Africa continuing to pressure. Countries like Colombia joining in that process. Even Spain seems to be taking a stronger stance. But again, I think we have to think about the loopholes in each of their, in each of the steps that they're taking, and at the end of the day, the question of whether that'll be enough to actually deter Israel is an entirely different question. And the answer to that, in short, is no.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please visit our website, al-shabaka.org, where you will find more Palestinian policy analysis and where you can join our mailing list and donate to support our work. So Spain, the Spanish Parliament passed a motion not long ago calling on the government to impose an arms embargo on Israel in response to its assault on Gaza. And it was introduced by the leftist alliance, which is part of the ruling coalition. And then it also recommends reforming Spain's foreign trade legislation to prohibit military agreements with any state accused of committing genocide or crimes against humanity. But the motion is non-binding, meaning that there are still quite a few stages that it has to go through before it becomes binding resolution. And the EU also announced that it was going to review its trade agreements with Israel. So it's difficult to see or to think about these actions as anything more than performative. I think Spain is possibly the one where we can maybe think about more seriously as a country that is willing to take more concrete action. But it does feel, all of this feels far too late. We're also seeing people pointing to things shifting in Israel. And in particular, they're pointing to statements said by opposition politicians, including Ehud Barak and Yair Golan, who is the opposition leader. And it feels like people are really sort of grasping desperately onto anything. Like, when you talked about David Lammy sort of really making a plea to Israel, to Israeli society, give us something. It feels like this is sort of in that same vein. Yair Golan, the opposition leader, he said that Israel is on the way to becoming a pariah state like South Africa was. And he said that a sane country does not fight against civilians, does not kill babies as a hobby, and does not give itself the aim of expelling populations. Now, this went viral in Israeli society. People were so shocked by this, and Netanyahu attacked him and accused him of blood libel, of course. But some in the international community are seeing this as a sign of hope, and they're already positioning Yair Golan as this antidote to Netanyahu. But it's worth reminding people who this man is. Yair Golan is, of course, an ex-Israeli army general, as they all are. And at the start of the genocide, he was enthusiastically calling for the starvation of all of Gaza. In fact, on the 13th of October 2023, he said the following. He said, "First of all, close all the electricity switches to Gaza. I think that in this battle, it is forbidden to allow a humanitarian effort. We need to say to them, listen, until the captives are released from our side, you can die from starvation. It's totally legitimate." So, is Yair Golan having a change of heart, or is he just reading the room and preparing himself to be the favorite of the international community to take over after Netanyahu? I think the latter. And I think also this shift is not happening in Israel. I don't know if, Dara, if you've seen those latest polls that were done in Israel with regards to support of the genocide, but overwhelmingly, Jewish Israeli citizens support the ongoing assault, the ongoing starvation, and the expulsion plans for Palestinians in Gaza.
I very much see it just as a matter of style over substance, right? And it's these people have tactical differences with the current Israeli government, right? Yair Golan, we heard a similar statement from Ehud Olmert, the former Israeli PM, who called it, the ongoing genocide a war of annihilation. And I think that at the end of the day, Golan, Olmert, Netanyahu, and Smotrich, they all have the same ultimate objective, which is, kind of based on the idea of maximum land with minimum Palestinians. However, Olmert, in my opinion, and Golan, that type of Israeli is a little bit more strategic and recognizes that the best way for Israel to achieve its end goal of maximum land with minimum Palestinians is to do so a bit more gradually and to shield their actions behind lofty, empty facades of human rights rhetoric, like Israel is the most moral army in the world and stuff like that. And they recognize that absolutely what Netanyahu is saying and what Smotrich is saying, their rhetoric combined with their actions in Gaza is absolutely turning Israel into a pariah state. So I think it's just, again, it's just that's a great microcosm of Israel as a whole, right? Because it's just a matter of people with different figures with different tactics and the same objectives. And then it ties into the wider population, right? I mean, I think it was over 80% of the Israeli population supports the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, and then 47% of Israelis supports the extermination of Gaza's population. Not much else needs to be said about that. So I think we can absolutely read the relatively minor tactical differences between Israeli leaders as just differences in style over substance. And I think it's also important to kind of look into the future and imagine what would happen if Netanyahu is not going to be in power in Israel forever. Obviously, Israel's right wing, the likes of Smotrich and Ben Gvir, they're there to stay, and they're only proliferating. But all it would take is a more quote unquote moderate government in power in Israel for governments across the West, the US, the UK, to basically throw their arms up in the air and declare victory and say, now we can continue returning to our status quo of unconditional support of Israel. And we can be happy about it. We can be proud about it. And I think that, Israel can continue its literal actions on the ground the same way and if they had different leadership that didn't say it so plainly, that would fundamentally change things. And I think that, again, we're going back to the same thing, where going back to David Lammy's speech, I mean, he's not saying that they're cutting Israel off. He's not saying that they're really applying conditions to its relationship with Israel. What he's saying is that they're applying conditions to this relationship with this current Israeli government at this current moment. And all this current Israeli government needs to do is give them the tools and the words to kind of prevaricate, return to that initial status quo.
Right, because it's a freeze on future trade negotiations, not on the current trade deals that they have or the arms deals that they have.
Another thing I would say is that I think it's like this is a really important case study in how genocide and ethnic cleansing is carried out in the 21st century. I think one of the biggest differences that separates genocide in the 40s, 1940s and 50s and 60s to today is that, genocide has become a much more public process, right? And, I think genocidal states or genocidal entities have to contend with the fact that their actions are going to be telegraphed to the world for the world to see. And that's not to say that they're not going to engage in genocidal acts, and that's not to say that they're going to change their genocidal objectives. It just means that they have to do it in a different way, right? In a way that covers it up in some ways and makes it a little bit more gradual process that normalizes it as a whole. And I think they have to manufacture consent for it so that the public doesn't step in and call for intervention. And I think that is one thing. And then the other thing that we're learning is how much public response it's going to take to trigger intervention, right? At what point in the genocide are we going to get to before not only the public says this is enough, but until the point that they can influence the actions of actual policymakers? And I think that is a huge disconnect. That is the main disconnect.
Right, because we have seen massive mobilization for Palestine and Gaza all over the world and consistently for months on end. And I think what this moment really tells us is that people power is not as powerful as we think it might be, and that democracy does not exist in countries where we fought, where countries in which they, are so proud of their democracies. If there is an overwhelming majority of people that have been against this genocide, why has it continued for so long? And so I do think that this moment is a very reflective moment. I think it tells us a lot about the world in which we live in. And I think there is a realization that the current world order is coming to an end. And I think, in that sense, the genocide has gutted the liberal rhetoric of a world order, and it's really stripped away its foundational illusions.
I think that hits the nail on the head because if you look back at the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years since the end of World War II, bring it back all the way till then, Gaza isn't the first genocide. Gaza is the first digitalized and telegraphed genocide to be seen across the world on social media, sure. Like you say, over the past couple of years, I think what we're seeing is a far wider problem that Gaza, it's opening the door for, it's acting as a warning of sorts. But what we're seeing is that democracies across the globe, I think, are increasingly insulated from mass politics, period. And because of that, I think we need to ask ourselves, okay, how do we, in general, affect policy change if our democracies, if our governments are so fundamentally isolated from the traditional process of mass politics, building people power, building enough support to get, behind policy. And I think tying this back to an individual issue, for example, gun rights in the US, a vast, vast majority of Americans want tighter gun restrictions. But to this day, because of the pro-gun lobby and because of the ideological issue that it's become, it's not actually being enacted into policy. And so what does that mean when such substantial majorities of people can be behind a certain policy change or a certain topic or a certain issue and not have that implemented in any way, shape, or form? How do we move forward in terms of how we organize and organize power? I think that completely changes what it means to be to be organizing and resisting in today's day and age.
So, Tariq, that leads me on to my final question. How can we mobilize in this moment where people in the mainstream media and Western political institutions are backtracking?
I think what we're dealing with right now is, again, it's much bigger than Gaza. It's much bigger than Palestine. I think what we're dealing with now is, again, it's fundamentally how do we engage in democratic mass politics, or why would we engage in democratic mass politics if mass politics has less and less influence on our governing structures and our governing institutions? My generation has always grown up to at least kind of believe if you get enough people in your camp, if you can, cultivate the support of enough people, that'll inevitably lead to political change, right? And I think that idea was kind of started getting shattered as early as, the Arab Spring, the Occupy Wall Street movement, and basically every attempted systemic revolution slash popular movement since, right? But then what comes next? If power is not affected by mass politics, then what is our role in politics? And I don't have an answer to that. If our role as everyday civilians is to cultivate growing opposition to Israel's genocide in Gaza, for example, in the hopes that enough pressure someday will be placed, for example, on the US government. But if the US government is becoming increasingly insulated to public pressure, especially on this topic, because it's so dependent on entrenched interests like the pro Israel lobby or the the military industrial complex, and if it is ultimately beholden to those over the demands of popular opinion, then where does that place us as civilians?
Yeah, I think you're right, Tariq, that it does. This moment does require us to reflect on a different kind of politics, and to realize that this is all connected to a question of global and capital interests as well. And if these massive demonstrations, these massive disruptions for literally months on end, from protests in the streets, from campus encampments, from the shutdown of weapons factories, all of these things, if they're not enough to even shift the needle a little bit, because we're not even talking about a massive shift, we're talking about even just a small shift. If that's not possible, what does that say about our political system? What does that say about the world order? And I think in many ways, as I said before, I think this world order is crashing down, and I think it is scary in a way. The unknown is always frightening. But I think one thing that I hold on to with change, is that there's always possibility. And also, we have to remember that the world order that we have been living in since World War II was not a world order that benefited the majority of people around the world. It was, it's supposed to be one that provides stability, self determination, territorial integrity, for all these states worldwide. But the reality is far more complex than that. In many cases, the world order has been used to support the continued colonization and the exploitation of countries in the global south. So this facade is falling. And I think that can be a frightening thing for some. But I think there is possibility, or we are entering into an era of possibility, to create something entirely different. And this isn't to romanticize or to overstate the possibility for that. But I think, we have around the world seen massive radicalization and politicization of people because of the genocide in Gaza. And I think for me, I'm more interested in those people than the people in the mainstream media, for whom this phrase is the tide is turning is being tied to. I don't care that Piers Morgan uttered the word genocide. I don't care that The Guardian published an editorial recognizing the horrific situation in Gaza. I care about the millions of people who have hit the streets consistently in solidarity with Palestine. And I think it's there where we'll see real possibility for change. But I think it requires massive, massive reflection on the current political system, and massive reflection on the current world order.
I think where this conversation is headed kind of reminds me a lot of other conversations that we've had at Al-Shabaka in terms of future visioning, right? And in terms of if and how we can envision a political future. And there's all these theories. I mean, there's hypernormalization, capitalist realism, like all these. I'm not the first one to say this. Basically, is that I think at this stage of capitalism, it's been very difficult to envision a world that is not a capitalist world, right? For example. And I think in many ways it is also very difficult to envision a world in which Israel does not exist as an apartheid genocidal entity, right? And I think that one possible first step in this process of thinking of new ways to engage in mass politics, both when it comes to Palestine and even wider than that, is really taking on a conscious effort to attempt to step outside of the boundaries that we have created for ourselves or fallen into in terms of our ability to envision or picture a new world, a world that is not confined by the realities of capitalism or by the realities of perpetual occupation and apartheid. And I think sometimes it's extremely difficult to envision a world that is outside of those confines. And that makes it extremely difficult to envision a world in which policy is not necessarily changed by mass politics. And I think that if we're trying to answer that question in the long run, I think it first takes us trying to, think about and again envision a future that is separate or outside of the confines that of capitalism, of occupation, of apartheid. And I know that that can sound really lofty, and I'm just throwing around kind of terms and stuff, but I think it's really simple. It's just a status quo that has been so thoroughly entrenched over so many years can become extremely difficult to think outside of, right? And I think that is a first step that we need to do, is we just need to try to figure out how to think outside of the status quo that we've become just so used to and that has become so deeply ingrained into our mindsets. And I think that is just a first step to then thinking about, okay, if the tactics and strategies we've been using for decades just don't apply anymore or aren't effective as they might have been in the past, what might work in this new world, right? And what could work for a future that we want to achieve? And I think that it's just like that first step of trying to, I don't know, call it thinking outside of the box or outside of the status quo or the norms that we've gotten so used to. But I think even doing that is an act in itself, is extremely difficult. It's a process. But I think it is something we need to do, because how can we think about tactics and strategy when, to be honest, like, sometimes we can't even envision the alternative, the end goal, the end objective. That is a first step. And I don't know what it looks like, but I think at least we can recognize that that's something that we can do.
Tariq, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Rethinking Palestine.
Thank you for having me on, as always.
Rethinking Palestine is brought to you by Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. Al-Shabaka is the only global independent Palestinian think tank whose mission is to produce critical policy analysis and collectively imagine a new policy-making paradigm for Palestine and Palestinians worldwide. For more information or to donate to support our work, visit al-shabaka.org. And importantly, don't forget to subscribe to Rethinking Palestine wherever you listen to podcasts.